Hi everyone, I am Michael from Family History Every Day, and in honor of Memorial Day coming up this week, at least here in the United States, I wanted to kind of go over a little bit about cemetery research and how to find ancestors that are buried in cemeteries. And I'm going to start today with digital cemetery hunting, different ways and tools that we can use to find our ancestors who are buried online, or not buried online, but rather the records are online of where they are buried. I think it'd be awkward to be buried online. Anyway, so a few little thoughts about that. But first of all, like, why is it a good idea? I think it saves time. So that when you go to a cemetery, you can go straight to the gravesite. You don't have to like wander rows and rows of gravestones and look for last names in your family tree, and you know they're here, but you don't know where they're here. When growing up, my dad would take me and my siblings to go see different grave sites, and we would do just that. We would go to pick a different part of the cemetery and walk around and look for headstones. And I think there's a more efficient way. Not to say that wandering around cemeteries can't be fun, but there's definitely ways of doing it to save time so you can go see more ancestors. And then lastly, I think it's really cool to be able to see family members that are buried nearby, which I think is also important because many families are buried close together in cemeteries. So there's two main sites that are used for grave site locations. The two are Billion Graves and FindAGrave. And I'm wanted to provide a kind of a comparison between the two, trying to be as unbiased as I can, um, with just showing the differences between them. FindAGrave has many more records than FindAGrave has many more records than Billion Graves does. They are owned by Ancestry as opposed to Billion Graves that's independently owned. Um, I think one of the biggest differences between FindAGrave and Billion Graves is that Billion Graves uses GPS coordinates to track all of their gravestone records in their database. That means that you can go into their their app or their website and using it find exactly where the headstone is using the GPS coordinates, which I think is pretty cool because then it allows you to go straight to the gravesite. FindAGrave has a lot of records, but they don't have very few GPS coordinates associated with those records. FindAGrave also has the ability to leave memorials for different individuals. One of their kind of side emphases is highlighting the graves of famous individuals. And Billion Graves is integrated with MyHeritage and perhaps others, allowing you to, at least when you're in FamilySearch, or when you're in, excuse me, Billion Graves, you can go into pull up an ancestor that find out where they're buried and then click on search for records and it pops up with MyHeritage and enables you to search for records that way, which I think is pretty cool. Both FindAGrave and Billion Graves have indexes for their records that are connected with FamilySearch, making them accessible through FamilySearch. And I wanted to just kind of walk through how I've done it with one of my ancestors. But first, I wanted just to give some references to appropriately cite my sources, just a blog and Billion Graves website that highlighting the differences between the two. So here we are one of my ancestors, and she came to my attention because her birthday was recently just happened, and FamilySearch sent me an email saying, "Here's your ancestors, it's your birthday." So it was cool to remember her and to go in here and look up where she was buried. And for her, it actually happens that both the FindAGrave and Billion Graves indexes have already been attached to her FamilySearch record. So I go to, you'll see here, the difference between this FindAGrave and this FindAGrave is this one includes her maiden name and this one only includes her married name. So this is the most accurate one. as I looked at it previously. So we can go in and look at the information. The Billion Graves entry has the GPS coordinates and the another information, whereas the FindAGrave has only the information about where it happened. But I think both are important to look at, so let's go through them. I've already pulled them up. And here in FindAGrave, we see information. This one has a picture of the headstone, information about the individual, family members, family portrait, and other things like that. That allows we can add a memorial to this individual and look up other information records using through Ancestry. Looking at Billion Graves, we see a lot of the same information, the headstone, the information about the individual, but I think one cool thing is it does allow us to go in and see where exactly that gravesite is located. So I've never been to Taber, Alberta, although I've been close to it and have many families from that area. So if I ever went there, I could pull up Billion Graves and go to the cemetery and go exactly to where this gravesite is located right there. And the image is not great because of the aerial photography and so forth. But there's that. We can go through here to search for the individual on MyHeritage, and it just does some other cool facts about how old they were when different events happened in their lives, which I think puts my ancestor in some cool historical context as well. It also shows nearby graves, and this happens to be her husband, um, buried close by on the same plot. So those are the differences between between Billion Graves and FindAGrave. I think both are great, and both have, I think, their strengths. And I think when trying to look for a grave, I would suggest to use both. I think there's good in both, and don't want to put all of our eggs in one basket. Certainly, the Billion Graves has the GPS coordinates, which makes it a little more verifiable. But I think the vast number of records in FindAGrave is also valuable as well. So use both, I would suggest, and just explore what works best for you and your family and where you can find records. Knowing that sometimes the GPS does provide a little more validation of the records. Also wanted to show up one other website. It's called the Cemetery Records Online, interment.net. And this is a really cool website I learned about just recently, where it has records of lots of individuals that are buried in cemeteries all around the world. And it shows where they are buried. Not all cemeteries are included here, but they take records from public cemetery records and put them on here. And you can see that there's some from all over the world, a lot here in the UK, some in Canada. But here, I just wanted to go to one that I do know that has several records. So I know that one of my ancestors was buried in Oregon, and so I can go to the state, to the county, and to one of the cemeteries close by. And here we can search for different names. Go in here, and we can just scroll in and scroll down and see that we have the burial date, the section, the lot, oftentimes where it is. So if we can't find it on Billion Graves or FindAGrave, we can maybe look here as well as a third source. I think this is a really good resource, and invite you to look into it as well. I'm excited to hear about your adventures, about finding ancestors online through these resources, and hope you have a wonderful experience doing so, especially this time of year as we get to remember our ancestors that have passed on, and to be able to visit them at the cemeteries. So that's the basic tutorial on how to find records online. I hope this has been helpful. I welcome any comments and hope you will have a wonderful day. Thanks.